The air in Prefect Kalen's residence was a monument to absence. It held no dust, no stray biosignatures, no lingering scent of food or life. It was processed, cycled, and returned to his lungs as a perfect, sterile nothing. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling chromia glass window, a stark silhouette against the geometric perfection of the concordant spire that pierced the perpetual twilight of the city. Below, light streams of transport vehicles moved in silent, orderly pulses, a circulatory system for a body politic that had excised the messy viscera of emotion. His uniform, a severe cut of obsidian polymer, absorbed the cool synthetic light, leaving him a void in the pristine white of the room. He was a function, an instrument of order. His thoughts, like the air, were filtered. He cataloged the day's reports with detached precision. A minor deviation in the sector gamma nutrient paste allocation, a recalibration of the atmospheric ionizers in the lower strata, a formal reprimand for a technician whose biorhythms had shown a flicker of unsanctioned anxiety. All corrected, all returned to baseline. The system worked because its components were predictable. He was predictable. Then came the summons, a soft chime that was less a sound and more a subtle pressure change in the room. He turned his movements economical and activated the comms panel embedded in the wall. The face of Director Valerius materialized, a placid mask of sculpted age and authority. His eyes, the pale gray of a winter sky, held no warmth. They were instruments of assessment. Prefect, Valerius began, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in Kalen's very bones. A situation requires your oversight at the sanatorium in Sector Epsilon. Kalen's posture remained unchanged, but a cold, clinical distaste coiled in his gut. The sanatorium. The very word was a euphemism for the Concordance's most persistent biological problem, the Omegas. They were genetic throwbacks, creatures governed by chaotic hormonal cycles, their existence a constant, messy reminder of the primitive biology the Concordance had striven for centuries to transcend. They were managed, suppressed, and utilized for procreation protocols under strictly controlled conditions. They were not people. They were resources, unstable resources. There is a new acquisition, Valerius continued, oblivious or indifferent to Kalen's internal state. Designate 734. He has proven resistant to standard integration protocols. His suppressant regimen is showing signs of potential instability. Your presence is required to ensure the transfer to a higher security wing proceeds without deviation. Resistant. The word was an anomaly in the Concordance's lexicon. Compliance was engineered, ingrained from birth. Resistance was a malfunction, a flaw in the code to be isolated and purged. I understand, Director, Kalen said, his voice flat, betraying nothing. This one is of a volatile lineage, Tiktu. Valerius added, a faint, almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. Confiscated from a rogue settlement in the outer zones, they still cling to archaic notions of pairing, of bonds. The last word was spoken with the same disdain one might use for a disease. We cannot allow such sentiment to contaminate the facility. Ensure the containment field is at maximum efficacy. We do not need a pheromonal cascade. A cascade. The term was sterile, scientific, but it described a biological storm Kalen found viscerally repulsive. The uncontrolled scent, the loss of rational thought, the reduction of an individual to pure, screaming instinct. It was the antithesis of everything he was, everything the Concordance stood for. Omegas were beneath him. They were beneath the dignity of a thinking being. They were a weakness, a genetic echo of a past that deserved to be forgotten. It will be handled, Kalen assured him. The director's image dissolved, leaving Kalen alone once more in the silent, empty perfection of his home. He ran a hand over his shorn head, the gesture methodical, a self-soothing motion he was not even aware of. For a moment his reflection stared back from the dark window, a man of sharp angles and rigid control, his face a study in disciplined neutrality. But behind the eyes a flicker of something ancient and unwelcome stirred, a deep-seated instinctual aversion to the chaos he was being sent to contain. He was a prefect. He was order. He was the wall that held back the tide of biological anarchy. He would go to the sanatorium, he would oversee the transfer of the flawed asset, and he would return to his clean, silent world, leaving the mess of flesh and feeling behind, locked away where it belonged. He dressed in the heavier, more armored variant of his uniform, the seals hissing shut around his wrists and neck, encasing him completely. It was not just for protection, it was a barrier, a second skin to keep the contamination of the place, of its occupants, from touching him. He was not an asset, he was not an experiment. He was a guardian of reason against the dying scream of instinct. The transport slid through the city's arteries, the world outside a blur of regulated light and shadow. He did not watch it. He focused on the schematics of the sanatorium displayed on his wrist-mounted data slate, memorizing patrol routes, security overrides, and the precise specifications of the pheromone scrubbers that kept the facility from descending into a miasma of biological signals. He was prepared. He was in control. The faint, rhythmic vibration of the vehicle was the only sensation, a steady pulse reinforcing the predictable, mechanical rhythm of his world, a world that was about to be fractured by a scent he could not have imagined, a scent that would rewrite the very code of his existence. He felt nothing. He told himself he felt nothing. And in the telling, the lie became a prayer. Against the chaos he was about to confront, the transport began its descent and the spire of the Epsilon Sanatorium rose to meet him, a sterile white needle against the bruised purple of the artificial sky, a place where life was not lived but merely managed, a place of quiet, screaming despair. Kalen closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a synaptic reset. Then he opened them, clear and cold as ice. The work had to be done. The air inside the sanatorium was different from the perfect void of Kalen's residence. It was trying to be sterile, aggressively so, but it was a losing battle. Beneath the sharp chemical sting of industrial-grade antiseptics and the ozone hum of the pheromone scrubbers, there was a faint, cloying sweetness. The smell of managed biology. The smell of bodies confined, of lives reduced to cycles and charts. It was the smell of resignation, and it clung to the pristine white corridors like a film. Kalen's boots made no sound on the polished composite floor as he moved, a specter of obsidian authority in a world of bleached white. Medtechs and orderlies in their pale gray uniforms flattened themselves against the walls as he passed, their heads bowed, their gazes averted. He was the embodiment of the Concordance's ultimate authority, a reminder that their work, their very lives, were subject to constant, unforgiving scrutiny. He ignored them. They were part of the machinery, cogs in the system of containment. He was met not by the facility's administrator, a man Kalen knew to be weak-willed and prone to administrative panic, but by a senior physician, a woman named Dr. Aris. Her face was a network of fine lines etched by stress, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and held a disquieting level of clinical curiosity. "Prefect," she greeted him, her voice crisp. "Thank you for coming. Designate 734 is in Observation Cell 3. We are preparing him for transfer." "Report on his condition," Kalen commanded, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "His physiological markers are erratic," Aris said, falling into step beside him. They walked down a long corridor, the only sound the faint, rhythmic sigh of the ventilation system. "His suppressant implant is functioning, but his system seems to be metabolizing the hormones at an accelerated rate. We've never seen anything like it. It's as if his biology is actively fighting the regulation." She glanced at him, a flicker of something, frustration or perhaps fascination, in her gaze. He refuses nutrient intake. He does not speak, he just watches. They arrived at a thick plasteel door marked with a crimson biohazard symbol. Beside it was a large one-way observation window looking into a cell. The room within was stark white, padded on all surfaces and bathed in a soft, constant light designed to prevent shadows. It was a room with no corners to hide in. And in the center of that room, on a simple, backless bench, sat Designate 734, Alien. The name was a ghost on his file, a relic from his life before acquisition, a detail Kalen had already mentally discarded as irrelevant data. He was just a number, a problem. But the figure on the bench was not just a number. Even through the thick polarized glass, Kalen could feel an intensity radiating from him, a stillness that was not passive but coiled, like a predator at rest. He was thin, his gray sanatorium tunic hanging loosely on his frame, but there was a wiry strength in the line of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. His hair was dark and unruly, a stark contrast to the regulated cuts of everyone else in the facility. But it was his eyes that held Kalen's attention. They were a deep, startling amber, and they were fixed on the observation window, on the spot where Kalen stood, as if the one-way mirror were no barrier at all. It was impossible. He could not see them. And yet Kalen felt pinned by that gaze, analyzed, dissected. His file mentioned scarring, Kalen stated, his voice a low murmur, tearing his eyes away from the Omegas to scan the data slate Aris handed him. From the acquisition, she confirmed, he fought the retrieval team. A primitive response. There are older marks as well, from his time in the outer zones. Kalen looked back into the cell. A long, thin scar cut across the Omega's left eyebrow, giving his otherwise symmetrical face a permanent questioning intensity. Fainter, silvery lines traced patterns on the backs of his hands, visible when he shifted his weight. He was a damaged specimen, flawed, defective, and yet there was a strange, unsettling grace in his movements, a deliberate economy that spoke not of weakness, but of a profound and deep-seated will. He was not broken. He was tempered. Kalen focused on the biotelemetry readout scrolling on the slate. Heart rate elevated but steady, cortisol levels high, pheromonal output, negligible but with micro spikes that were being instantly neutralized by the implant. The system was holding, but Aris was right. It was fighting. It was like watching a graph of a siege, the slow, relentless pressure of biology against the unyielding wall of technology. Prepare the transfer team, Kalen ordered, handing the slate back to Aris. I will oversee the procedure from this station. I want a full-spectrum pheromone analysis running in real time. Any deviation beyond 0.01%, and you trigger a Level 3 containment protocol. Of course, Prefect. Aris hesitated for a moment. There is one other thing. His scent profile from the initial processing before the implant was activated. It was unclassifiable. It didn't match any known Omega pheromonal markers. It had elements we typically associate with alpha territoriality, bergamot, ozone, but underscored with something else, something we have no name for. Kalen's jaw tightened. An anomaly. He hated anomalies. They were loose, threads in the perfect tapestry of the concordance. They had to be pulled, examined, and ultimately snipped away. Irrelevant now, he said, dismissing her concern with a wave of his hand. The implant renders him inert. Proceed. Aris nodded and moved away to issue the orders. Kalen was left alone before the window, the silent Omega his only company. He watched as Elian slowly, deliberately, raised a hand to touch the scar over his eye. It was not a gesture of vanity or pain. It was a gesture of remembrance, of identity. In this sterile white box designed to erase him, he was reminding himself that he existed, that he was more than a number, A cold knot formed in Kalen's stomach. This was not the vacant, placid compliance he was used to seeing in Omegas. This was defiance. It was quiet. It was profound. And it was aimed directly at the system Kalen embodied. He pressed his hand against the cold glass of the window, his reflection a dark shadow superimposed over the Omega's form. For a fleeting, terrifying second, the two figures seemed to merge, the prefect and the prisoner, two sides of a coin he never knew existed. He recoiled internally, the thought a blasphemy. He was nothing like this creature. He was control. It was chaos. He was the future. It was the past. And yet, he could not look away from those impossible, knowing amber eyes. He felt a strange, unwelcome premonition, the feeling of a man standing on a perfectly stable floor who suddenly feels the first, almost imperceptible tremor of the earthquake that will bring the entire building down around him. He was a prefect. He was order. The tremor was just an illusion. It had to be. The first sign was not a sound or a light, but a change in the pressure of the air. A subtle, almost subliminal hum that vibrated up from the soles of Kalen's boots. A low thrum of machinery under strain. He saw it on the monitor before he felt it in the room. A single jagged red line spiking through the serene green grid of the pheromone analysis. A deviation. 0.02%, then 0.05. The containment field was failing to keep up. A soft, automated voice, devoid of inflection, echoed from the ceiling panels. Warning, pheromonal signature breach in observation cell 3, suppressant implant malfunction detected. Initiating level 3 containment. Red light began to pulse through the corridor, bathing the sterile white walls in a rhythmic, bloody glow. The transfer team, who had been assembling outside the cell, froze. Dr. Aris swore under her breath, a sharp, uncharacteristic breach of professional decorum. Her fingers flew across her data slate. "It's not just a malfunction," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of alarm and scientific disbelief. "The implant is being dissolved. His body is producing a counteragent. It's impossible. The technology is flawless." Kalen's attention was fixed on the cell. Through the window, he saw Elian shudder, a violent, full-body tremor. The Omega curled in on himself, wrapping his arms around his torso as if trying to hold himself together. A low sound, a pained gasp, was picked up by the cell's audio sensors, a raw note of agony in the clinical silence. And then, the scent hit. It was not a gradual leak, it was a detonation. The scrubbers and filtration systems whined, overwhelmed, and then the air was thick with it. It bypassed the nose, the lungs, and struck directly at the base of Kalen's skull, a synaptic explosion. Aris had been wrong. It wasn't unclassifiable. It was everything. It was the ozone scent of a lightning strike just before it hits the earth, sharp and electric. It was the deep, resinous smell of a pine forest after a fire, the scent of destruction and new growth intertwined. It was the metallic tang of fresh blood and the impossible, heartbreaking sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. It was every contradiction, every primal note of life and death, pain and longing, all woven into a single, overwhelming signal. Kalen felt his knees threaten to buckle. His training, his conditioning, his entire life had been a fortress against this. He was an alpha, a genetically perfected one, but his instincts had been suppressed, cauterized, bred out of him in favor of pure logic and control. He had never truly scented an omega in heat. He had only read the clinical descriptions, the dry data points of a biological process he found revolting. The data had not prepared him for this. The data was a black and white photograph of a supernova. This was not just a scent, it was a story. It was a broadcast of pure, undiluted emotion. In that single moment, Kalen felt the sheer, crushing weight of Elian's existence. He felt the cold terror of the outer zones, the sting of loss, the burning defiance of his capture. He felt the profound, aching loneliness of the sterile white cell, the bone-deep weariness of a spirit that refused to break, and beneath it all, a desperate, powerful yearning, not for release, not for a mate, but for recognition, for a witness. To be seen not as a designate, not as a specimen, but as a person. The alpha part of him, the vestigial, dormant creature he thought long dead, roared to life. It was a violent, shocking awakening. It wasn't the possessive, dominant urge described in the archaic texts. It was something else entirely. It was a fierce, savage instinct to protect, to soothe, to answer the desperate call that was flooding his senses. His mind, the cold, logical fortress of the prefect, was reeling. This is a biological weapon, a contamination, a loss of control. It is a threat to be neutralized. But the instinct, raw and powerful, screamed a different truth. This is pain. This is a soul crying out. Go to him. Prefect. Eris's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. We need to flood the cell with neuroinhibitors, sedate him before he goes into full cascade. Kalen turned his head, the movement feeling slow, syrupy. He saw the panic in the eyes of the orderlies. He saw the cold, scientific focus in Eris's. They saw a problem to be solved, a malfunction to be corrected. They did not feel what he felt. They could smell the pheromones. Yes, their own alpha and beta physiologies would be reacting on some level, but they were not experiencing the empathic torrent. This was for him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. This scent, this call, was tuned to a frequency only he could receive. No, he said, his own voice sounding distant, unfamiliar. Prefect, the protocols are clear. The protocols are insufficient, Kalen interrupted, his gaze snapping back to the window. Elian had collapsed onto his side, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. The scent intensified, laced now with a new note of pure terror as he felt his body betraying him, losing the last vestiges of control he had fought so hard to maintain. Kalen felt that terror as if it were his own. The red lights flashed across his face, illuminating the stark conflict warring there. He was Prefect Kalen, an instrument of the concordance, a being of pure, unwavering logic. His purpose was to contain this chaos, to follow protocol, to press the button that would flood the cell with sedatives and reduce the magnificent, terrifying creature inside to a docile, manageable state. But the man inside the uniform, the alpha he never knew he was screaming at him. The system is wrong. The protocols are a lie. Order built on this much pain is not order. It is a cage. He saw his reflection in the glass again, a dark figure bathed in warning lights. He was not a guardian. He was a jailer. And the only thing that mattered in that moment, the only truth in a world of meticulously constructed lies, was the agony of the man in the cell. The choice was made before he was even aware of making it. Logic shattered. Conditioning broke. The prefect was gone, and something new, something terrifying and unknown was looking out through his eyes. The world narrowed to a tunnel. The flashing red lights, the distant shouts, the frantic tapping on data slates. It all faded into a dull, peripheral roar. The only thing that was real was the scent, a living entity that coiled around him, pulling him forward. It was a lifeline and an anchor, a desperate plea and a defiant roar. He felt Elian's panic, a sharp, stabbing fear of being overwhelmed, of being trapped not just by the cell, but by his own biology. Kalen's hand went to the control panel beside the observation window, his fingers hovering over the override controls for the cell door. His training screamed at him. Protocol violation, contaminant exposure, compromise of command integrity. Dr. Aris grabbed his arm. Prefect, what are you doing? You can't go in there. It's a Class A biohazard event. Your own physiology will be compromised. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that was not cold, detached authority. It was a raw, primal intensity, a fire that burned away the years of conditioning. "His pain is a biohazard, why?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "His existence is a contamination?" The words were not his own. They were a rebellion, spoken by the instinct that had seized control of his body. He shook her hand off, not with violence, but with an absolute, immovable finality. His fingers keyed in his command override sequence. The system registered it, the automated voice announcing, "Prefect level override engaged. Deactivating level 3 containment protocols in observation cell 3. Magnetic lock disengaged." A heavy, resounding clank echoed through the corridor as the locks on the plasteel door retracted. A collective gasp went through the assembled personnel. This was not just a breach of protocol, it was insanity. It was a prefect, the ultimate symbol of control, willingly walking into the heart of the chaos he was meant to suppress. The door hissed open a few centimeters and the scent billowed out, a physical wave of heat and emotion. It was tenfold what it had been through the filtration system, a staggering, intoxicating force. Kalen didn't flinch. He walked forward, every step a deliberate act of treason against the man he used to be. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing him in. The world outside vanished. He was in the White Room. The soft, shadowless light seemed to hum with the energy pouring off the Omega on the floor. The air was so thick with pheromones it was almost liquid, shimmering with heat. It coated his tongue, his skin, his lungs. He felt it sinking into him, rewriting his cellular structure, awakening genes that had slept for generations. Elion had pushed himself into the farthest corner of the cell, his back pressed against the padded walls. He was on his knees, head bowed, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His whole body was a taut line of resistance, fighting the overwhelming tide of his own heat. When the door opened, he had flinched, expecting orderlies with needles, expecting the cold, clinical process of sedation and violation. But when he looked up through his sweat-soaked hair, he saw the prefect, the obsidian figure of authority, the embodiment of his oppression. Fear, sharp and icy, lanced through him, a new and terrible addition to the feverish agony of the heat. But the Alpha who stood before him was not what he expected. There was no aggression in his stance, no predatory gleam in his eyes. He simply stood there just inside the door, his hands held loosely at his sides. He was breathing heavily, as if he had run a great distance. And his eyes held a look of profound, shattered shock. He looked like a man who had just witnessed the death of his god. Kalen's mind was a maelstrom. The proximity was overwhelming. The empathic's broadcast was a deafening symphony of pain, defiance, fear, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical void. He could feel the frantic, terrified pulse of Elion's heart as if it were beating in his own chest. He could feel the fire in his veins, the cramping of his muscles. The prefect in him, the last dying echo of his old self, tried to analyze, to categorize. Pheromonal induction of empathic response, mirror neuron activation, synaptic hijacking. The clinical terms were meaningless, hollow shells against the tidal wave of raw experience. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. Elion flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a sound of pure defiance, a warning from an animal that was cornered and had nothing left to lose. Kalen stopped. He held up a hand, palm open, a universal gesture of peace that felt archaic and absurd in this sterile environment. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. His voice was rougher than usual, scraped raw by the intensity of the moment. Elion's amber eyes narrowed, blazing with fever and suspicion. He didn't believe him. Why should he? Kalen was the system. He was the cage. Kalen knew this. He knew he had to prove it. He slowly, deliberately reached up to the collar of his uniform. With a hiss of depressurization, he unsealed the neck clasp, then the chest plate. He unbuckled the armor piece by piece, letting the obsidian polymer fall to the soft white floor with a muffled thud. He was stripping himself of his authority, of his protection. He was making himself vulnerable. It was the only language he could think of that Elian might understand. When he was down to the simple black undertunic, he stopped. He was no longer a prefect. He was just a man. An alpha. Yes, the scent in the room was making that undeniable. His own pheromones beginning to respond. A low, grounding note of cedar and cold stone, rising to meet the storm of Elians. But he was holding it in check, a feat of will that was costing him everything. He took another step. Elian was still tense, but the growl had subsided. He watched Kalen, his head tilted, a flicker of confusion warring with the fear in his eyes. "Your name is Elian," Kalen said, the name feeling strange and powerful on his tongue. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. "You are not 734. You are Elian." A single tear traced a path through the grime and sweat on Elian's cheek. The scent in the room shifted a subtle modulation. The terror receded a fraction, and a note of profound, aching grief took its place. The grief of a man who had not heard his own name spoken with anything other than contempt for a very, very long time. Kalen knelt slowly, carefully, until he was on Elian's level, about 6 feet away. He did not try to get closer, he simply waited, a statue of quiet patience in the heart of the storm. He was offering a choice. He was ceding control. In this small white room, the power dynamic of their entire world had been inverted. He was the prefect, the one with all the authority, and yet he was the one on his knees, asking for permission. Elian, the prisoner, the Omega, held all the power to trust, or the power to reject. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by their ragged breathing. Outside the door, Kalen knew chaos was erupting. But in here, a new kind of order was being forged, a fragile, terrifying order based not on rules and regulations, but on the magnetic, undeniable pull of two souls recognizing each other across an impossible divide. The hum of the shadowless lights was the only constant. Kalen remained on one knee, a supplicant before a pyre. The heat radiating from Elian was a visible shimmer in the air, the scent a physical presence that seemed to have its own weight and texture. Kalen's every instinct, newly and violently awakened, screamed at him to close the distance, to offer comfort, to shield the trembling Omega from the storm that was consuming him. But the logical part of his mind, the prefect's cold calculus, knew that any sudden movement, any perceived act of aggression would shatter the fragile, nascent trust he was trying to build. So he waited. He made himself a fixed point, an anchor of stillness in Elian's turbulent sea. Elian watched him, his amber eyes dilated, a universe of pain and fevered confusion swirling within them. He saw the discarded pieces of the prefect's armor on the floor. He saw the man, stripped of his symbols of power, kneeling before him. It was a scenario so far beyond the realm of his experience that his mind struggled to process it. Alphas did not kneel. Prefects did not show vulnerability. The system did not offer choices. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. But the empathic torrent flowing between them told a different story. He could feel the brutal war waging inside Kalen, the shattering of a lifetime of conditioning against the irresistible force of this new, terrifying connection. He could feel the Alpha's desperate effort to control his own instincts, to project calm and safety when every cell in his body was screaming with the need to react. It was not a trick. It was real. Slowly, shakily, Elian pushed himself up from his corner, his movements stiff with pain and exhaustion. He did not stand. He crawled. He moved across the soft white floor with a painful slowness, his gaze never leaving Kalen's. He was like an animal approaching a strange new element in its environment, a fire that could offer warmth or incineration. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his breath a ragged, hitching sound. The scent of his distress, of his hope, of his terror, washed over Kalen in a fresh wave. It smelled of scorched earth and the first drops of rain. "What do you want?" Elian's voice was a raw whisper, his first words torn from a throat dry with fever. The question was simple. The answer was impossibly complex. What did he want? A week ago, an hour ago, he would have wanted containment, neutralization, the restoration of order. Now he wanted to understand the force that had shattered his world. He wanted to quiet the screaming agony he felt as if it were his own. He wanted to see the defiance in Elian's eyes turn to peace. "I want to help you," Kalen said, and the truth of the words stunned him. He had never wanted to help anyone. He had only ever wanted to enforce compliance. Elian let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into a cough. "Help me," he rasped. "Your kind doesn't help. You manage, you control, you use." The bitterness in his voice was a shield forged in years of pain. "I am not who I was," Kalen said, the admission costing him a great deal. "When your heat began, I felt it. Not just the scent. I felt your everything. The pain, the fear." He looked down at his own hands, which were trembling slightly. "I don't understand it, but I will not let them sedate you. I will not let them turn you into an object on a table." The cell door chimed. A voice, filtered through the comm system, crisp and cold, filled the small room. It was Director Valerius. "Prefect, open this door immediately. You are compromising a valuable asset and endangering the entire facility." Kalen's head snapped up, his eyes locking on the hidden speaker. The blood drained from his face. Valerius, the architect of his former world. Elian flinched back at the sound of the director's voice, a conditioned response of fear. The scent of his terror spiked again, sharp and acidic. "Prefect Kalen, I am giving you a direct order," Valerius's voice continued, laced with steel. "You will step away from the Omega. The medical team will enter and stabilize the situation. Your lapse in judgment will be dealt with later." Lapse in judgment. That was what this was to him, a temporary insanity, a malfunction. Kalen looked from the speaker, the disembodied voice of the system, to Elian, the living, breathing heart of the chaos. He saw the raw terror in Elian's eyes, the certainty that the brief, strange respite was over, that the clinical violation was about to begin. And in that moment, his choice solidified from a desperate instinct into a conscious, irrevocable act of rebellion. He would not let Valerius have him. A new voice, a calm and chilling presence, materialized from the comms, overriding the director's stern command. "Director, stand down." It was a voice Kalen recognized with a jolt of cold dread. Dr. Alina Kignis, the head of the Concordance's Genetic Purity Division, a woman who saw living beings as strings of code to be edited and compiled. Prefect Dr. Aris's telemetry is showing a unique bioresonant feedback loop between you and the asset, a sovereign pair configuration. Theoretical, of course, until this moment. Kalen felt a cold dread snake up his spine. Sovereign pair, a myth from old. Genetic texts. A 1 in a billion perfect biological and psychic match between an alpha and an omega, creating a bond so powerful it could rewrite the genetics of both, amplifying their strengths to an unforeseen degree. A bond the Concordance had been trying and failing to artificially engineer for decades. They were not a prefect and a prisoner anymore. They were the system's holy grail. They were the ultimate experiment. "Your protective instincts are not a lapse, Prefect," Cygnus continued, her voice laced with a disturbing predatory excitement. "They are a symptom of the bond's formation, a desirable one. You are imprinting. We must study this. We must document every phase. Do not interfere with the asset's natural cycle. Your role now is to observe and engage as your instincts dictate. We will record everything." The clinical horror of her words was worse than any threat. They were not going to sedate Elian. They were going to watch. They were going to turn this intimate, agonizing, transcendent experience into data. They were going to vivisect their bond for the good of the state. Kalen felt a rage so pure and cold, it burned away the last vestiges of his old identity. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. And Elian was not a resource to be tapped. He rose to his feet, turning his back on Elian to face the hidden camera in the cell. He was shielding Elian with his own body. "You will not touch him," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl that was pure alpha. "You will not watch him. You will not turn him into a line of code on your screen." "Your compliance is not optional, Prefect." Cygnus's voice was like ice. "You are a component of this experiment now. A valuable one, but a component nonetheless. Open the door, or we will open it for you." Kalen knew she was not bluffing. They could flood the room with gas, cut the power, breach the walls. He had minutes, at most. He turned back to Elian. The Omega had heard everything, his eyes wide with a new kind of horror. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a prize. "We have to go," Kalen said, his voice urgent. "Now, we have to get out of here." Elian stared at him, his mind reeling. "Go where? There is nowhere to go. There is only the Concordance. There is the outside, Kaba," Kalen said, the words feeling foreign, rebellious. "The outer zones you came from. Anywhere but here." He extended a hand. "I can get us out. I know the systems. I know their protocols. I can use their order against them. But you have to trust me." Elian looked at Kalen's outstretched hand. It was the hand of his enemy, his captor. But it was also the hand of the only person who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a number. His body was on fire, his mind was a storm, but in the center of it all was a single clear point of certainty. To stay here was a death of the soul. To go with this impossible, shattered prefect was a chance, however slim, at life. His own hand, scarred and trembling, rose to meet Kalen's. As their fingers touched, a jolt of energy, pure and white-hot, arced between them. It was not just skin on skin. It was the closing of a circuit. The bond, which had been a chaotic one-way broadcast of Elian's pain, suddenly became a two-way conduit. Kalen gasped as he was flooded with Elian's entire being, not just the pain, but the strength, the resilience, the unyielding core of his identity. And Elian, for the first time, felt Kalen. He felt the prefect's loneliness, the crushing weight of his perfect, empty world, the terrifying, exhilarating agony of its destruction. In that single touch, they knew each other. "Okay," Elian breathed, his fingers tightening around Kalen's. "I trust you." Kalen pulled him to his feet. Elian swayed, his legs weak, and Kalen wrapped an arm around his waist, taking his weight. The contact was electric, sending a fresh wave of fire through them both. But it was also grounding. They were two halves of a whole, and they had just found each other. "They'll be coming," Kalen said, his mind already racing, calculating, a prefect's tactical brain now repurposed for rebellion. "Stay close to me." He pulled the comms unit from the wall with a sharp tug, silencing the voices of their captors. The escape had begun. The moment the comms unit went dead, Kalen knew the clock was ticking. They would interpret the loss of signal as an act of aggression, a confirmation of his non-compliance. The tactical teams would be mobilizing. He had at best 5 minutes before they breached the cell. His mind, once a serene landscape of logic, was now a whirlwind of tactical possibilities, fueled by a ferocious, protective urgency he had never known. The bond with Elian was a constant hum beneath his thoughts, a low thrum of shared consciousness. He could feel Elian's fear, his pain, but also his resolute trust. A silent current that strengthened Kalen's resolve. "The emergency ventilation shaft," Kalen said, his voice low and urgent, more to himself than to Elian. "It runs parallel to this corridor. The access panel is behind the west wall." He ran his hand along the padded surface, searching for the seam he knew from the schematics was there. His fingers found the faint indentation. Using the edge of a piece of his discarded armor, he pried at the seam. The panel, designed for maintenance access, not security, popped open with a soft sigh, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. "It will be a tight fit," he said, glancing at Elian, who was leaning heavily against him, his body still racked with tremors from the heat. The scent was still powerful, a beacon that would draw every alpha in the facility to them, but it was also their shield. The sheer intensity of it would disorient and overwhelm anyone not attuned to it as Kalen was. It was a weapon as much as it was a vulnerability. "I can manage," Elian gritted out, his jaw tight with determination. Kalen helped him through the opening first, into the cramped, dusty darkness of the maintenance shaft. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old wiring and lubricant. It was a stark, almost welcome contrast to the sterile air of the cell and the overwhelming intensity of Elian's scent, which was now blessedly contained within the narrow space. Kalen slipped in after him, pulling the panel shut. It clicked back into place, leaving them in near-total darkness, the only light a faint red glow from the emergency systems filtering through the grate above. The sounds from the corridor were muffled but clear. The heavy thud of mag boots, shouted commands, the high-pitched whine of a plasma cutter preparing to breach the cell door. They were just in time. "This way," Kalen whispered, his voice a ghost in the dark. He took the lead, moving with a surety born of years studying the facility's blueprints. The shaft was narrow, forcing them to move sideways, their bodies pressed together. Kalen could feel the feverish heat radiating from Elian's skin, the slight tremble of his muscles. The physical contact intensified their connection. Kalen could feel Elian's pain as a dull ache in his own bones, and in turn, Elian could feel the sharp, focused edge of Kalen's tactical thoughts, a calming, grounding presence in the storm of his heat. They moved in silence, their shared consciousness a more effective communication than any words. Kalen navigated the labyrinthine network of shafts, his mind a map of the facility. Turn left at Junction 3B. Avoid the primary exhaust vent for Sector Gamma. Thermal sensors are too sensitive there. Access the lower sublevel via the coolant conduit network. Every decision was swift, precise. He was using the system's own intricate design, its own obsession with order and contingency as a weapon against it. He was a virus in the machine. Elian followed without question. The heat was a roaring fire inside him, but Kalen's proximity was a strange balm. The Alpha's scent, that cool, grounding fragrance of cedar and stone, did not seek to dominate or possess him. It was a shield, a protective barrier that seemed to hold the worst of the fever at bay, allowing him a sliver of clarity. Through their bond, he saw the path ahead through Kalen's eyes, anticipated the turns, understood the risks. He was no longer just a passenger in this escape. He was a participant, his trust and resilience a fuel for Kalen's strategy. After what felt like an eternity of shuffling through darkness, Kalen stopped. He pointed to a grate below them. "Waste reclamation level," he whispered. "The scent scrubbers for the entire facility vent down here. They use incinerators to purge the filtered pheromones. If we time it right, we can use the purge cycle to mask our scent completely." It was a huge risk. The incinerators fired at precise, scheduled intervals. If they mistimed it, they would be instantly vaporized. But if they succeeded, they would be ghosts, their pheromonal trail erased from the facility's sensors. Kalen pressed his wrist slate against the grate, its diagnostic sensors interfacing with the network. He brought up the incinerator cycle timer. 30 seconds until the next purge, yeah. he breathed. "We have to move the moment it's done. We'll have a 90-second window before the sensors reset." The 30 seconds stretched into an eternity. Below them, a low hum began to build, the sound of powerful machinery spooling up. Elian's hand found Kalen's in the dark, his grip tight. He felt Kalen's pulse, steady and calm despite the immense danger. A wave of blue-white light flashed from below, accompanied by a deafening roar and a blast of superheated air that shot up the shaft. For 5 seconds, the world was fire and noise. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Silence rushed back in, thick and absolute. "Now!" Kalen commanded. He kicked the gray and it fell away with a clang. He dropped first, landing lightly on the metallic floor below. He turned and caught Elian as he followed, steadying the Omega as his legs buckled. They were in a vast, cavernous chamber filled with enormous, complex machinery. The air was scorched and smelled of ash and ozone, the ghost of a million neutralized scents. An alarm klaxon began to blare from the far side of the chamber. "They know the shaft was accessed," Kalen said, his voice grim. "They'll be converging on this position." He pointed toward a massive blast door on the far wall. "That leads to the outer perimeter loading bay. It's our only way out." They ran. Elian stumbled, his body screaming in protest, but Kalen half-carried him, his arm a steel band around his waist. Through the bond, Kalen pushed his own strength, his stamina, his unyielding will into Elian, a silent, desperate transfusion of energy. They reached the blast door just as the first squad of Concordance enforcers, clad in the same obsidian armor Kalen had discarded, appeared on the gantry above them. "Prefect Kalen, draw!" A voice boomed over the loudspeaker, a voice he recognized. It was Jovan, his second in command, a man Kalen had trained himself, a man who believed in the system with the same fervent, unquestioning faith Kalen once had. "Surrender the asset. Do not make us fire on you." Kalen ignored him, his fingers flying over the door's control panel. "Access denied. Security lockdown." Of course. He slammed his fist against the panel in frustration. They were trapped. Jovan and his team were rappelling down from the gantry, their weapons raised. They were forming a semicircle, cutting off any retreat. Kalen pushed Elian behind him, shielding him once more. He was unarmed, unarmored, facing a squad of elite soldiers he himself had molded. It was over. But then he felt a surge through the bond. It wasn't from him. It was from Elian. The Omega, leaning against the cold steel of the blast door, closed his eyes. He was not giving up. He was focusing. The scent, which had been a chaotic storm of pain and fever, began to change. The wild, sharp edges smoothed out. The terror receded. What rose in its place was a pure, concentrated wave of something else. It was the essence of their bond, a powerful, resonant frequency of absolute loyalty and fierce defiance. It was not a scent of submission or need. It was a call to a singular alpha. A declaration. The enforcers, all alphas themselves, faltered. Their aim wavered. The pheromonal wave was not for them, and the exclusion was a psychic blow. It was a scent that said, "He is mine, and I am his. You are nothing. You are irrelevant." They clutched their heads, disoriented, their own alpha instincts confused and repelled by this powerful, exclusive signal. Jovan, stronger and more disciplined than the others, pushed through the effect, his face a mask of pained confusion. "What is this sorcery goo?" he snarled. Kalen seized the opportunity. While they were disoriented, he turned back to the panel. He couldn't override the lockdown, but maybe he could short it out. He saw a thick power conduit running into the control mechanism. He looked at Jovan, at the man who was a perfect reflection of his former self. "The system is a lie, Jovan," Kalen said, his voice ringing with a conviction that shook the younger man. "It's built on pain, on cages. True order doesn't come from suppression. It comes from connection." With a roar, Kalen ripped the conduit from the wall, Sparks flew. The lights in the chamber flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The emergency klaxon sputtered into silence, and the massive blast door, its magnetic locks disengaged by the power surge, began to groan open. A sliver of the bruised twilight of the outside world cut through the darkness. Hope. Kalen grabbed Elian's hand and pulled him through the opening, into the cold, unfiltered air of the loading bay. They were almost free. The air of the loading bay was cold and sharp, tasting of metal and rain. It was real air, not the recycled, sterile atmosphere of the sanatorium, and the shock of it was like a plunge into icy water. Kalen pulled Elian behind a stack of cargo containers just as the emergency power kicked in, flooding the bay with the harsh, yellow glare of backup lighting. Shouts echoed from the reclamation chamber behind them. They had moments. The loading bay was a vast, semi-enclosed space, one side open to the perpetual twilight of the city's lower levels. Transport skiffs were docked at several platforms, their engines dormant. Their path to freedom was 50 yards of open ground away. Kalen's tactical mind assessed the situation. The enforcers would emerge, fan out, and lock down the bay. They would expect him to try and steal a skiff. It was the logical choice. Therefore, it was the wrong one. "They'll expect us to go for the transports," Kalen whispered, his breath pluming in the cold air. Elian was shivering beside him, the sudden drop in temperature a shock to his fevered body. Kalen instinctively pulled him closer, sharing his own body heat, the gesture automatic, protective. "We need to do the unexpected." His eyes scanned the cavernous space, catching on a detail he had only ever seen on schematics. A service rail, a small automated platform used by maintenance drones to access the upper structural supports of the bay. It was slow, exposed, and not meant for personnel. No one would ever expect them to use it. "There, Ray," he pointed. "It will take us over the perimeter wall, not through it." Just then, Jovan and his squad emerged from the blast door, their weapons sweeping the bay. They moved with the lethal, predictable efficiency Kalen had taught them. They ignored the service rail entirely, their focus fixed on the docked skiffs. "Fan out, secure all transport vessels, set weapons to stun. The assets are to be taken alive." Jovan's voice boomed, full of frustrated authority. This was their chance. Keeping low, using the containers for cover, Kalen led Elian on a circuitous path toward the service rail's access ladder. Every step was a risk. A stray glance, a reflection in a puddle could give them away. The bond between them was a silent, taut wire. Kalen felt Elian's exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that went beyond the heat. He was running on pure will. In return, Kalen projected a sense of unwavering certainty, a mental image of the open sky beyond the walls, a promise of freedom. They reached the ladder. It was slick with condensation. "Can you climb?" Kalen asked, his voice low. Elian nodded, his jaw set. He started up the rungs, his movements slow but steady. Kalen followed close behind, his body shielding Elian's from view, ready to catch him if he fell. They were halfway up when a shout came from below. "There! On the ladder!" One of the enforcers had spotted them, the air filled with the high-pitched whine of stun bolts. Blue energy blasts sizzled past them, impacting the metal wall with loud cracks, showering them with sparks. Adrenaline surged through Kalen. "Faster!" he urged. They scrambled the rest of the way onto the small platform. Kalen slammed his hand on the activation panel. With a lurch, the platform began to move slowly, ponderously along the rail, rising up and out of the loading bay. They were completely exposed, a perfect target. The enforcers below were firing relentlessly. Kalen stood in front of Elian, his body a human shield. A stun bolt caught him high on the shoulder. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot explosion of agony as his entire nervous system seized. He grunted, his vision tunneling, but he did not fall. He braced himself against the railing, taking the hit, absorbing it. Through the bond, Elian felt the lightning strike of Kalen's pain, and it was a strange and terrible catalyst. His own fear and exhaustion were burned away by a surge of pure protective fury. He grabbed Kalen, holding him upright, and for the first time, he was the one giving strength. He pushed back through the bond, not a complex thought, but a raw, primal feeling. Mine. Do not touch. His pheromonal output, which had been a beacon, now became a weapon of surgical precision. He focused it not as a wave, but as a tight, targeted beam aimed directly at the man who had been Kalen's second. Jovan cried out, stumbling back as if struck. He dropped his weapon, his hands flying to his temples. He was a good soldier, a disciplined alpha, but he had never faced a psychic assault like this. The focus signal was a spike of pure Omega defiance, a rejection so absolute it destabilized his alpha identity. He saw Kalen not as a traitor, but as a bonded alpha protecting his mate. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. It was a violation of the natural order as he had been taught it. He was paralyzed. His hesitation broke the morale of his squad. Their firing became erratic, then stopped altogether. They watched, confused and disoriented, as the platform continued its slow, inexorable journey upward. Kalen sagged against Elian, his arm numb, his vision slowly clearing. He looked down at Jovan, who was staring up at them, his face a mask of shattered certainty. Kalen had not defeated him with strength or strategy. Elian had defeated him with a truth the Concordance had tried to erase from existence, the power of a bond. The platform cleared the top of the perimeter wall. Before them lay a sight neither had ever truly seen. Not the manicured, controlled parks of the city's upper strata, but the real world, the outer zones, a sprawling, overgrown landscape of ruins and resilient, wild nature, stretching out to a horizon where a real sun was setting, painting the toxic clouds in hues of orange and violet. The air was different here. It was alive. It smelled of damp earth, of decay, and of growing things. It was the scent of freedom. The platform came to a stop at a maintenance gantry on the outer side of the wall. They were out. They had done it. Kalen's legs gave out. The delayed effect of the stun bolt and the sheer exhaustion of their ordeal finally catching up to him. He collapsed to his knees on the rusty metal grid of the gantry. Elian knelt beside him, his hand on Kalen's uninjured shoulder. The heat was still afire in his veins, but it was no longer an agony. It was just a warmth, a steady glow that was mirrored by the quiet strength humming between them. They were fugitives. They were scarred. They were exhausted. But as they looked at each other in the dying light of a real sun, they were not a prefect and an Omega. They were Kalen and Elian. And for the first time in their lives, they were free. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was not the sterile, manufactured silence of the Concordance, but a rich, layered quiet, filled with the whisper of the wind through skeletal ruins and the distant cry of some unseen creature. The air, unfiltered and raw, was a shock to their lungs. For Kalen, it was an assault of chaotic, organic information. For Elian, it was the smell of home, a scent he thought he would never experience again. He breathed it in, a long, deep draft of memory and relief, and the tight knot of fear that had lived in his chest for so long began to loosen. Kalen remained on his knees, his head bowed, the weight of his transformation pressing down on him. He had not just escaped a facility, he had escaped the entire framework of his identity. The man who was Prefect Kalen was dead, his ashes scattered in the scorched air of the reclamation chamber. The man who remained was a stranger to himself, an alpha whose instincts were raw and new, whose entire purpose had been rewritten in the span of a few hours. He felt Elian's hand on his shoulder, a small point of warmth and solidity in the vast uncertainty of his new existence. The touch was not a demand or a claim. It was an anchor. "We made it," Elian said, his voice quiet, still rough from dehydration and strain. Kalen looked up. His gray eyes, which had always been as cold and controlled as the city he served, were now filled with a profound, aching vulnerability. "I don't know what to do now," he admitted. It was the truest thing he had ever said. All his life he had been given orders, protocols, a clear path. Now the path was gone. The map was blank. "For now," Elian said, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders, "we rest. We survive." He looked out over the sprawling expanse of the outer zones. "It's not easy out here, but it's real." With a shared effort, they helped each other to their feet. Elian's heat, while no longer the raging, agonizing storm it had been, was still a powerful presence, a constant fever humming beneath his skin. But now, with Kalen beside him, the bond acted as a regulator, a feedback loop that kept the worst of it from overwhelming him. Kalen, in turn, drew a strange strength from it. The empathic connection, once a disorienting flood, was now a steady current, a source of information and reassurance. He could feel Elian's weariness, his lingering pain, but also his deep, resilient hope. It was a hope that was slowly taking root in the barren soil of Kalen's own soul. They descended the gantry service ladder, their movements slow and careful. At the bottom, their feet touched soft earth for the first time. Kalen stared down at the dirt, at the blades of tough wild grass pushing through it as if it were a marvel. He had only ever walked on polished composite and sterile metal. This was messy, unpredictable, alive. He reached down and touched a leaf, its texture rough and veined, and felt a flicker of wonder. They found shelter in the husk of a pre-concordance building, its walls crumbling but its roof mostly intact. As the last of the light faded from the sky, a profound darkness fell, a blackness punctuated only by the cold, distant light of the stars, unobscured by the city's artificial glow. Kalen had never seen stars like this. They were a terrifying, beautiful chaos, a stark reminder of how small and insignificant the Concordance's rigid order truly was. Elian curled up on the dusty floor, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Kalen stayed awake, taking watch. He sat with his back to the wall, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night, his senses sharper than they had ever been. He could hear the skittering of small animals in the ruins, smell the approach of a rain shower on the wind. He was no longer just seeing and hearing. He was perceiving the world in a fundamentally new way. The alpha instincts the Concordance had tried to breed out of him were not the savage, mindless urges he had been taught to fear. They were tools of survival, of perception, of protection. He looked at Elian, who was sleeping fitfully. His face softened in the deep shadows. The scars on his hands and face were testaments to a life of hardship, a life Kalen could barely comprehend. He had been born into the apex of the system, while Elian had been born in its shadow, a primitive to be harvested and controlled. Yet in this moment, Elian possessed a strength and a wholeness that Kalen, with all his genetic perfection and disciplined training, had never known. Elian knew who he was. Kalen was only just beginning to find out. He was not a prefect. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Kalen, and he was bonded to the Omega sleeping beside him, the man who had torn down his world and, in its place, offered him a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. The future was a vast, unknown territory. They were fugitives, hunted by the most powerful, technologically advanced society in the world. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the strange, powerful connection that hummed between them. It was not enough, and yet it was everything. As the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly on the broken roof above them, Kalen felt a flicker of something he had only ever read about in forbidden texts. It was not the cold satisfaction of a completed task or the placid contentment of a well-ordered life. It was a fierce, fragile thing. It was hope, and it was enough to see them through the night.